I introduced the entire town board a moment ago, but on behalf of all of the members of the town board, I now introduce Councilmember Robin Wilt. Robin has served on the town board for over 5 years. She has served in a very important function of liaison from the town board to the Town of Brighton Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Advisory Board, which is the volunteer board that led and leads our inclusion, diversity, and equity efforts. That board, working with consultants and town staff, developed our IDEA plan, our inclusion, diversity, and equity advisory plan that guides us and that we are implementing really in everything that we try to do. So, Councilmember Wilt, Robin Wilt.
Thank you, everyone, and I want to welcome you again this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. This is, of course, a time of celebration, but as I get older, I also, put on my historian hat, and I like to contextualize these cultural events in the context of the history that got us here. And so, my speech today, there will be a little uncomfortableness, I promise, but I think it's important that we acknowledge the history that embodies some of the legacy of King. So, on display in Washington, D.C., in the National Museum of African American Heritage, there is a Bible on loan from Fisk University, the historically black university in Nashville, Tennessee. The Holy Book is called Parts of the Holy Bible Selected for the Use of the Negro Slaves in the British West India Islands. And I am of British West Indian descent, so this tome is more commonly referred to as the Slave Bible. The so-called Slave Bible excludes all of Exodus, in which the Jewish people, of course, escaped bondage from Egypt. In fact, about 90% of the Torah, or Old Testament, and about 50% of the New Testament are erased from the Slave Bible. For example, its pages include quotes like, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters," from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. But missing is the portion of Paul's letter to the Galatians that reads, "There is neither bond nor free, for ye all are one in Christ Jesus." As Americans, confronting our history with racism, this religious relic compels us to grapple with a timeless question. In our interpretations of history and of historical figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is the end result liberation or domination? Are we whitewashing our history and historical figures? When I think about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and how his values and efforts influenced my life and career today, I first have to reconcile what I learned about Martin Luther King Jr. growing up as a student in Pittsburgh Pittsburgh's public schools during the 1980s. Then I contrast that with what I understand from reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s own writings and researching for myself his actions during his lifetime. From what I've read of Martin Luther King's writings, such as the sentiments expressed in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, or King's last sermon, which was entitled, "Why America May Go to Hell," the perceptions we have of Martin Luther King Jr. as a historical figure are very much shaped by the narrative that best serves those whom our societal systems were designed to benefit. In other words, our institutions are designed to serve those who are in power. The scholar and historian Cornel West talks about the Santa Clausification of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And by that he means that the establishment embraces the palatable and the non-threatening parts of what Martin Luther King instructed, but largely erases his radicalism. Just as in the case of the Slave Bible, The teasing and self-serving teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. are often selectively quoted, while the more scathing criticism Martin Luther King reserved for America and its institutions are erased. Hence, we often view Martin Luther King Jr. as a non-controversial figure, a non-violent, non-abrasive man who said we should all love one another. However, King's search for racial justice and black empowerment found him consistently decrying the huge chasm between the lofty rhetoric of American democracy versus its at times very brutal reality. Martin Luther King Jr. was by no means an establishment figure, as we may be tempted to believe from the larger-than-life legacy that follows him today. While today Martin Luther King's polling numbers are generally positive, as our Assembly member mentioned, a far more frequent reaction to the man during his lifetime comported with images of rage and scorn. To say that Martin Luther King was reviled by those in power would be an understatement. During his lifetime, Martin Luther King Jr.'s disapproval ratings hovered at about 65%. J. Edgar Hoover said he was the most dangerous man in America. President Johnson called him an N-word preacher, and I paraphrase. Fellow Christian ministers, white and black, closed their pulpits to him. Young revolutionaries dismissed and tried to humiliate him with walkouts, booing and heckling. Life magazine, echoing Time magazine, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, all bastions of the media establishment, trashed King's anti-war stance as demagogic slander that sounded like script for Radio Hanoi. And the leading black journalist of the day, Carl Rowan, wrote in the Reader's Digest that King's exaggerated appraisal of his own self-importance and the communist influence on his thinking made King persona non grata to Lyndon Johnson, and has alienated many of the Negro's friends and armed the Negro's foes. Now, despite all of that, one of the last true friends of King, the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, prophetically said, "The whole future of America will depend on the impact and influence of Dr. King." Now, it might be tempting to think that the issues of racism that King spoke of are all in the past. After all, we no longer have segregated drinking fountains, and blacks are no longer required to the back of buses. However, here in Brighton, in over 200 years of government, I'm only the second African American to serve on the Brighton Town Board. Likewise, we live in the 5th most segregated community in the nation. A system and a society that is content with that kind of disproportionality is one that is still in dire need of reform, the likes of which a radical King sought. I'm always keenly aware, in my current role as a member of the town board, of how the democratic body on which I serve is designed to marginalize certain perspectives and suppress dissent and challenges to certain groups who maintain privilege and power. Fundamentally, the educational, political, and economic systems of the United States, and those in Brighton, were not designed to advantage people who look like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and they certainly weren't designed to benefit people who look like me. And it's for that reason, in my role on town board, I try to speak truth to power for those members of marginalized communities who may not be present at the table. So when I consider my career in public service in the context of Martin Luther King Jr., I'm always cognizant of the voices of dissent. Rather than fear them or silence them, I welcome them as the echoes of King. I know that without those voices, we cannot improve our democratic systems. King's full-throated support for racial and economic justice can be seen in our own time across a broad continuum of voices, among which I include my own. The radical King's influence, whom I embrace, is best seen in the political actions of a new generation of activists and organizers and those committed to so-called good trouble, who honor his continuing legacy with protests and actions that push the nation closer to the beloved community that King envisioned. King defined that community as not only a world free of racism, war, and poverty. He argued that justice was what love looked like in public, and that all citizens could achieve greatness through a purpose-driven life of service. In my approach to public service, I very much aspire to achieve the example that King offered to all Americans: a life dedicated to the mission of social justice and human rights, representing our ultimate purpose and greatest vocation. So when people call me a radical, I smile. Because were it not for the radicals like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we would be a nation complacent in our inequity. So thank you so much for honoring King's legacy today, and I encourage everyone to take part in actions that would fulfill his notion of a beloved community. Thanks.
Wednesday night at our Brighton Town Board meeting, the Town Board unanimously issued the following proclamation, which I will now read. Whereas Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. promoted his belief in the equality of all people and courageously employed the principle of nonviolence as his primary strategy to fight for freedom and justice for all, ultimately losing his life by assassination after enduring years of personal sacrifice. Whereas Dr. King's legacy